To the cloud. All right. So, hi everybody. We're here today with Maywa, who you might see around campus, or at least in Zoom Castle at UC Santa Cruz, because she recently started her position as a professor in environmental studies, which some of you already know. So I'm going to talk with Maywa about various things because she and I share a lot of interests and activities, but also Maywa has a lot of experience in different things that I think are really pertinent to the course. So first, just wanted to say thank you for coming. And also, maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about how did you end up being a professor of environmental studies? What was your sort of trajectory to where you are now?
Yeah, great question. Well, I was attracted to environmental studies at Santa Cruz because it is one of the first programs, if not the first program in the country to explicitly entangle environmental science with social science. And so they codified this environmental studies program. My background, undergrad, is actually in molecular biology. So I was looking at protein mechanisms inside a microbe, and was really more of, I guess, a science nerd at the time. I literally lived on the science quad and did most of my work in what you might recognize as a pre-med track, except I was interested in maybe doing plant biology. So part of that work, writing a dissertation, a bachelor's thesis, I was thinking about the applied aspect of this. And one of the things that they would do with the microbe that I look at was create genetically modified crops. So Agrobacterium tumefaciens is provides the plasmid DNA into which this transgene is usually put into the crop. So I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So there's actually a real world application, and it got me thinking about I might want to do genetic engineering for a living. And so I was starting to think about plant biology, PhD careers. I also got some feedback early on that maybe my gift was a little more in writing and narratives, because I remember spending a ton of time on an organic chemistry report, and the feedback that I got on it was very beautifully written. It said nothing about my lab techniques or anything. It was just this was a beautiful thing to read. So when I finished undergrad, I actually decided to take a bit of a turn, and I went to a science journalism program, and I did a master's degree in, it was called science writing at MIT. They do have a humanities department, and it's not very big, but I spent my master's degree time looking at rice, at the different aspects of it, culture. The rice genome was sequenced in the year 2000. There was big Time magazine cover debates about golden rice. So I just went at it like a classic journalist, snowballed a lot of stuff, interviewed a lot of folks. And coming out of that, I'd learned a ton about rice, but I was still convinced that the best thing that I could do was become, somebody who had a science degree and could really speak authoritatively to this work. I almost at that time committed to going to UC Davis for a PhD in plant biology still. I decided against that for a bunch of reasons, but basically just this weird feeling about I'm just not sure if I want to spend my life at a lab bench. I just didn't know if I was ready to do that. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I wound up applying for an internship at a magazine, and I spent 7 years living in Manhattan working at a magazine called Seed, where I helped sort of carve out some of their first environmental coverage. I guess I was on the green beat, talking more about sustainable development, intersections with environmental science. And of course, when it comes to developing countries, feeding the world comes up a lot, big time. 2008, I was sitting at my desk and started reading feeds about this global food crisis. So as a journalist does, I pick up the phone. I'm like, hey, Raj Patel, what is this food crisis about? Hey, Nina Fedorov, who was the science advisor for Secretary Hillary Clinton, also a plant biologist, advocate for genetic engineering, her view on what the world food crisis is about. Pamela Ronald, genetic engineer. Lots of folks telling me we're running out of food. We need to genetically engineer more crops. I was like, oh, that sounds great. I know how to do that. I'm like thinking there's lots of things that resonate with me about a new green revolution, a locally adapted green revolution, one that could be much better. And then people like Raj, I got to know Jahi Chappelle, telling me like, we have more than enough food to feed the world. What are you talking about? And I had what today I would call an epistemic crisis, like a knowledge crisis. I didn't really know how to make sense of these narratives that were like completely opposed to one another. Like I just was like figuring out how to write copy, and I didn't understand how to make sense of them. I was like, okay, I should go back to school. And that is what propelled me in 2011 to go hit the books again, apply to a PhD. 2011 to 2018, I was a grad student at Berkeley, wrote my dissertation on seeds, political economy of agrobiodiversity. So that's agricultural biodiversity. Studied a lot about intellectual property rights. Got into, I don't know how it happened. It just happens when you're in grad school. You meet people, got to know these radical people called agroecologists, landed in a Latin American studies or Latin American,
Latin American studies
movements course with Clara Nichols. Yes, Latin American studies with this kiddo who comes in on his skateboard. And we're like talking about social movements for agroecology, start to understand what is this thing called food sovereignty. And so while I didn't write my dissertation about agroecology, I feel like I spent probably as much, if not more time, learning about agroecology as an alternative to the dominant food system we have. And that's essentially, I was hired to be a social science professor of agroecology at Santa Cruz. That was the description of my FTE, of my hire. So just goes to show you don't have to be a like card carrying agroecologist to come into the movement and come into the practice of it. That's my life.
Yeah. Also, I think it's awesome because you described this sort of a similar thing I've shared in my history that I try to tell people about, which I call parallel university, right? Whenever you're in a learning environment, you're also really choosing to learn about other things that are really, in some cases it's because people they're studying something they actually don't care about. In your case, you studied something interesting that you cared about, and the agroecology part was so related but different, and you brought it together, and now you're able to connect those things and be an expert in both things in a way. So that I think that's really something that's I really appreciate, because I feel like too often our society makes us think of ourselves in only our credentials or what we're officially known for, but there's all sorts of knowledge that gets developed. And yes, that class was super important for me as well, in meeting lots of cool people. And it was, can't believe it was 10 years ago. That's what happens.
Oh my goodness.
So you had your kind of, it sounds like you always basically loved writing and had that journalist sort of period and experience. How would you say you've balanced, a lot of times there's kind of this idea that academic work is really esoteric and it's, it's separate from the real world. How have you worked on sort of either linking those, or what's your approach or thoughts about the idea of like, how do we translate science for the public, or how do we have science be engaged with the public and not the ivory tower?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. It's been a journey, I think, because part of what feels good about becoming, let's say, a social scientist is becoming familiar with the terms and the jargon, and you sort of feel like you've had an accomplishment if you can sling around these terms like primitive accumulation and spatial fix and all this stuff. And so you feel in some ways good about being able to write a really solid literature review and put out your theoretical framework and so on. And I will say jargon can be helpful because you don't have to re-explain terms. However, I think anybody who reads my papers, they generally come away with like, this is not like, it's pretty accessible, it's easy to read. And I kind of do that on purpose. Like I feel really put off when I encounter writing that it's just, there's a certain kind, it feels very insider to me. It feels like it's almost intentionally keeping some people out of the conversation. So even my peer review papers, like I work really hard, like on a line by line level to make them like easy enough to read. And outside of peer review, what I have done, and I know you've done some of this too, Antonio, is look for publications that are open to sort of like crossover pieces. Civil Eats is a good example. NCA magazine, like where I've been able to carve out the time. I've like tried when I'm working on a piece to like write something that's related, but it's an intentionally different audience. So there's something about agroecology on NCA. There's a piece about GMOs. They've probably gotten more like page views than most of my my peer review pieces, and have gotten me like, I don't really see it as like antagonistic in any way, because you get invited to stuff and you get to meet people and learn stuff and contribute to your growth as a researcher, partly through like this public science profile. I really enjoy that. I feel like that really just feeds my soul, more so than just writing to a narrow set of like 10 scholars who are really part of this field or like whatever I happen to be working on at the moment.
Yeah, and just for what it's worth, I do assign your NCA piece on GMOs because I feel like there's a lot written in the literature on GMOs, no doubt. But in terms of an accessible and sort of comprehensive look at the debates about GMOs, like that's a better piece than anything else you could find that's going to inherently be more narrow and sort of focused on one or the other debates within the literature about GMOs, right? So I think that that's something that unfortunately there's not a precedent in peer-reviewed literature to have this idea of sort of surveys or broader societal relevance as the focus, right? Because you're really speaking more to the debates in the literature. Cool. But
yeah.
So are you
stylistically too? I just will add that I've never seen a peer review publication that actually has like embedded hyperlinks. As you know, you can actually pack a lot more like references to stuff if you can just link, and you can't do that in any peer reviewed journal as far as I know. And when you have that like kind of leveling of like being able to throw in references to stuff just through the links, it opens up lots of ways to like actually embed more knowledge than you might think. So anyway, that's how I think about it.
That's a really interesting sort of proposition, like imagining the next wave of peer review that is more publicly accessible, because also, of course, the links could be vetted by the peer reviewers to say, oh, this is an actual good source, versus this is like the Flat Earth Society or whatever. But the thing is, for a reader, I've heard from non-academics that like just the fact that you have to get interrupted by these names or footnotes and all these kinds of aspects of reading that people aren't used to prevents people from often sort of absorbing and enjoying the reading process. So I can imagine like if you write science like that, a lot more people would actually want to read it. So we should work on that. We're going to work on the pushing agroecology. We're going to work on Food Systems Journal is going to change their format in the next 10 years. So more recently, I know, so you started your job at Santa Cruz. Let's talk about this first, and then maybe if we have time, we can come back to talk more about sort of what you were doing for your postdoc and sort of that latter part of your work before you came to Santa Cruz, because I think it relates to GMOs, but it's sort of more broad than just the question of the production of GMO crops, right?
Mhm.
But I'm really curious about more since you came to Santa Cruz. It seems like you've gotten involved in some of the politics on campus and some of the organizing on campus. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that, what motivated you. Also, maybe talk a little bit about your recent piece for Journal of Peasant Studies, which I didn't assign, but some students might be interested in.
Sure. So I think for me, it began really with, many of you probably are familiar with something called the COLA strike, or the cost of living adjustment strike, that started in December, I believe early December of 2019. And I was already part of this faculty organizing group listserv at Santa Cruz, and was just reading about, oh, students are on a grading strike. What is that about? And so just being a part of the online conversations over labor struggles among the grad students, started to work more across departments, not even yet being a faculty member, just being a postdoc still at Davis, and learning about housing insecurity in the Santa Cruz area. Of course, we know from the Guthman and Richard Walker, what is the roots of housing insecurity? It's land prices and, urban rural struggles over high costs of land and rent. So there's links there to what we study, but it also started giving me a greater appreciation for the institution of the UC as a whole, and how it rewards or doesn't reward certain kinds of work. That issue over the cost of living adjustment and the strike, it kind of spread UC wide. So Berkeley also department by department struck, Santa Barbara, Davis, many other campuses got involved, and I joined an intercampus group to kind of a faculty to continue supporting the students. After the murder of George Floyd, this movement never died, never went away, but it definitely evolved to focus more on the issue of cops and policing on campus. So we have sort of reassembled and reconstituted with both all the campuses of the universities of California and the California State University system to look at the issue of police on campus and the potential, and I would say the necessity, to abolish the police on campus. So I've been learning a lot from my colleagues who are much more, I would say, experts and scholars of the Black radical tradition about what it means to be an abolitionist, about the demands of abolition from the perspective of a view of racial capitalism. And I've been trying to think about how that comes into conversation with agroecology. So that has been my project, kind of my what's fed me for the last year in lockdown, in COVID, is thinking through those intersections, and have been also grateful to have many good conversations with you, Antonio, about it. As somebody who lives in this space too. And I'll leave it there for now if you want to ask different questions about it.
Well, I mean, that's a good intro. I mean, I think I really appreciate that. I think what's going on here is for one, that it's an anomaly for how academia tends to work, right? You as an academic produced a piece really pushing a conversation in a very well-regarded space for this field. For students probably don't know, but the Journal of Peasant Studies is consistently ranked basically the #1 journal around issues of food systems development studies, peasant studies, as they call it. And so talking about abolition politics in that context is very remarkable for the academic world. But the fact that you started doing that from a position of advocacy and grounding yourself in the movements that were calling for those things as a learner, right? Not as a expert who is coming to teach people about abolition, but rather someone on a learning path. I think that's just really not normally what we see from people on a tenure track position, right? In a tenure track job, you're typically just trying to prove your worth and stick to what you know so that you can be safe, you know? And so I just think it's really awesome to see it. You know, I wish I had written that article too, you know, because I think that part of the thing about the abolition piece that I hope gets across to in this class and in general is that it really challenges these really mainstream notions about social change, this idea that things have to be as they are, or that if they can change, they can only change in these sort of reformist ways, and that to have anything other than a reformist vision of society is to be utopian and unrealistic. And certainly those charges are leveled against abolitionists today, but the sort of uptake of abolitionist thinking around police, in my mind, has really shifted a lot in the last year. And so I'm very excited for the idea of like, wow, what if we started thinking about food systems in that same way? And that's something that's definitely come up in our conversations in the class so far, where students are identifying things like capitalism and colonialism as these macro structures. How do we envision a world beyond that? So I don't know, maybe you could just, since they're not assigned to read your piece, maybe just talk about like a couple of the things you found that you were really interested in, that you saw resonances between agroecology and abolition.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the really big pieces that inspired me from the start was understanding that on a certain like linguistic level, abolition can often seem like it's just negative. It's about destruction, and it's about eradication of the police, policing, the prison industrial complex. It certainly is about those. It's about a requirement to overcome and destroy systems of racial oppression and white supremacy and the different forms that it takes through imperialism, colonialism, you know, the take what form you have. But in abolitionist theory, they often talk about the production and protection of borders. So we can think about like ICE immigration and detention centers as a form of carceral violence. So it's about the destruction of all kind of forms of violence. However, it has this really nice, nice is not even the right word, the dialectic, to use the jargon, of presence, of creating alternatives in order to make the eradication or abolition possible. And so it's always about the growth or the building or the production of life-affirming institutions, of new norms, of reciprocity, of creating kind of different ways of living in relation to one another. They don't often say in relation to one another and the earth, but that's where I'm like, oh, agroecology is absolutely about those new forms of seeing ourselves in relation to each other and the planet, and those forms of rights and responsibilities that scholars like Hannah Whitman have talked about in relation to like food sovereignty and agroecology. I'm like, agroecology is the presence we're talking about. This makes so much sense to me. So that was what really inspired me, is kind of seeing the presence of the life-affirming presence as like just almost like blinking, blaring lights of like where agroecology comes into this picture. From the other side, it also helped me see like, whereas agroecology is often thinking about building up itself as an alternative, the scaling up, which we don't like, but we talk about scaling out, or massifying or amplifying agroecology. The flip side of this argument is we can never do that unless we are serious about abolishing the agro-industrial complex. Like, there's no way it makes sense. You're always going to be sort of either co-opted or crushed by systems of racial capitalism if you're not serious about what it means to squash empire, or what it means to squash like the disciplining forms that capitalism produces and makes those alternatives impossible to achieve. So that's kind of where I was like, this makes so much sense in terms of both like a parallel theory, but also I wanted to think then like movement building. How can we like build these communities together and actually bring together folks who are working, I think often in more urban contexts for abolition, especially prison industrial abolition, and more rural contexts, oftentimes for agroecology and food sovereignty. We don't have enough folks, so we got to bring them together. So that's what made me excited to talk about it.
That's really, it's so overlaps with some of the readings and sort of debates that we go over, particularly, you know, in Josh Spica's work, he talks a lot about the, like, you know, the secession versus confrontation. And there's a lot of this sort of debate in the literature. Oh, is this alternative food network thing, you know, sort of too prefigurative? Oh, it's not confronting the system enough. And versus, you know, the other side, which is maybe supposed to be better, which is, you know, pushing companies for better wages or things like that. And from what you're talking about, it's kind of clear that there is definitely a both and required to make a vigorous politics that actually can could possibly overcome the system. You need to both tear down the existing structures of disempowering injustice, and you need to build these alternatives. And unfortunately, for the most part, there's been a lot of like parallel tracking, and even in the academic literature, I would argue too much like pitting them against each other. Too much of this sort of, this side is better, that side is not right, or, you know, the reverse. So hopefully there's some inspiration in abolition for like, doing both.
Yeah, so this question of reform comes up a lot, both in agroecology and in abolition. Like, we don't like the reform solutions, the reformist solutions, the ones that are kind of by definition going to keep us trapped in the systems that is the status quo. And yet, like, you wrote some really nice language about this that I think we never wound up using, Antonio, in our ERPI paper, which was like, how do we know, like, on the time scales of like generations, is this going to be like a dip in the cycle and we're going on an emancipatory trajectory? Or is this going to keep us kind of locked in? And so abolitionists talk about non-reformist reforms. It doesn't mean necessarily that we have like revolution tomorrow, but it means that we have some ways, some methods and metrics of checking in and kind of keeping ourselves accountable to the work. So we know the difference between like a non-reformist reform and one that is like bad, that, you know, reformist. And I think that that's really hard. It's not, I don't think anybody has figured it out. Like, how do you know? But there may be ways of kind of checking in to see whether a given choice or decision or practice is, and there, Miriam Kaba has like a checklist to like check in and see how are you accountable to your communities? Is this producing forms of survival, or is it extracting from them? And I think a lot of those are also resonant for our work in food sovereignty and agroecology, especially some of these like international debates that are coming up with the UN Food Systems Summit. Is like, is this good for us? Because we're like getting elevated. There's more discussion on the global level about food systems change, or is this a reformist reform? So that, I think the watchwords and the methods and practices of understanding like the ease with which reformist stuff happens, that also really spoke to me in the struggles that are parallel but also overlapping in both spheres.
Yeah, and definitely, I mean, since we had a discussion last week about GMOs, there was a lot of clarity there, at least there seemed to be consensus that there's not a lot of hope for reforms by the companies themselves, right? And so you can see in ecology, like there's the debates about, oh, do we want to democratize organics, right? Do we want large agribusiness going into the organics market that expands the acreage of organics, but does it undermine sort of the transformational potential of organics? Those are longstanding debates. And I think that we can see that generally speaking, when abolitionists approach it, it's community-based, community-led kinds of reforms that are at all meaningful. and they don't usually take as meaningful things where like, you know, where basically the penal industry is deciding to do something better, right? So I think there might be parallels to apply as well there, where we can look at the principles of sort of how things are approached.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to also bring up, so because we're gonna, I think the last week we're gonna have some readings and discussion, and now we do have our recently published paper that I'm going to have folks read instead of what I used to assign. And so maybe we could together, I mean, you can start, but basically we can tell the story of how ARC came about. And that's the Agroecology Research-Action Collective that Maywa and I co-founded some years back. And sort of, you know, it speaks to a little bit, it's not super connected to abolition per se, but I think this idea of collectivizing also, that's another contrast that I see, is how much in the food space we've been dominated by these individual consumer narratives, but also individual producer narratives. It's about supporting the entrepreneurial farmer, right? Not about collective strategies, not about existing as collectivities. And so I think that there is that in the food space. It's just been more marginal for a long time. And it seems like right now it's starting to trickle up a little bit more. So maybe you could just talk about how sort of collectivizing ourselves as scholar activists, how, at least how that emerged for you in your mind. And then we can talk a little bit about what ARC has done. And
yeah, I'm pinging a little bit off of what you just said, because I see that a lot in like the abolitionist organizing space. I think there's like threads of anarchism, because there's a lot of emphasis on mutual aid. There's a lot of rubbing against binaries, which is like an affront to like Western Cartesian dualities of like, you know, we have the pro or the con and the good and the bad. A lot of this work is led by trans people of color. And so I've really been appreciating being able to slosh around a lot in like things that are orthogonal to the ways that we've always been trained to think about the food systems, and also like alternatives to the problems. So I'm like, oh, there's so many more possibilities than like either or. So that's great. What Antonio is talking about, ARC, the origins really came out of what I believe was an attempt early in the, I think 2015 or so, there was a, you know, international symposium on agroecology, and an attempt afterwards to start doing regional meetings to bring civil society groups and academics together to talk about agroecology on different continents. But North America was not a part of that for various reasons. And I believe it was Barbara Gamble-Herron and others were like, we should do something in North America, because, you know, it's a big part of the problem. So it has to be a part of the solution. I believe Hans Herron said something almost verbatim to that effect. And we started to think about the potential to have a North American agroecology forum that would convene a meeting, a conference, and we started putting together calls and invitations to bring people into that group. It became a little tricky because we were like scholars thinking about bringing in everybody from like farm labor to indigenous communities to like, I don't know, meat packing workers. Like, what are we doing? How are we making decisions when we haven't brought those people in yet? So through some, go ahead.
Really, there was this idea that like, okay, we as academics might think that that's a good idea to have a conference, but how do we even know that that's the right thing to do, or the right use of energy for all these different sectors, right?
Right, and I think that's perfect, because it's like kind of this this box you can get yourself into. You're like, well, that's a good idea, but that's because I thought about it, and like here I am speaking from a relative position of privilege. Maybe it's not. I need to ask. And so I think as we were able to dialogue a bit more with representatives of La Via Campesina North America, U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, Pesticide Action Network, and others, National Family Farm Coalition, we got the feedback eventually that it might be better for us to reorganize as a smaller, nimbler group of academics willing to kind of commit to certain principles and practices and kind of think about how we're going to put ourselves on the line for this work, but not try to represent everybody yet, because we don't have that purchase. And so we started to think about, okay, ARC is going to be a set of, academics, or scholars, I should say, rather, because we include both academics and non-academics.
Meaning
yeah.
Who don't have academic positions, right? Because there are people who are scholars who aren't associated with the academy per se.
Yeah, we have folks working in different NGOs, independent people who contract independently. So we started thinking about ARC as scholar activists, and to try and piece together what our principles and protocols for ethical and accountable and movement-led research would look like. And that you'll see in the paper that you get to read for this class is fairly simple set of principles, but we got feedback on those through rounds of conversations with movement groups, and consider them sort of a set of living principles, but we've not really had to radically touch them too much, because we still have to live up to them. They're still aspirational, right?
Also, just that we've gotten very positive feedback from when it's gone out into the world. So there hasn't been reason to really update them, because they haven't been proven inadequate or bad in different ways yet.
Yeah. And I think the other thing maybe to point out is also to lift up that we hardly invented this as a theory. There's loads of history and tradition, ranging from Paulo Freire, Orlando Franz Boas, to be thinking about decolonizing the research process and inverting knowledge making, bringing communities in, and reorienting the whole pipeline of research questioning. What we've seen so far, at least in North America, is that a lot of this sort of happens on a one-to-one basis. So the academic might be really hip to decolonizing theories and methodologies, and they'll work really hard to create these elaborate MOUs with indigenous communities, but it sort of remains siloed within their lab or their university. Maybe it passes on to their grad students, but we were sort of hoping to collectivize this whole process by bringing together like-minded scholars in the US, Canada, and Mexico to think about what if we could hold ourselves accountable as a larger body of scholar activists who have our roots in different places and spaces, but we are thinking along the same line. So I think that's sort of what we're trying to do a little bit differently. But I want to lift up that we didn't invent this thing.
Yeah. And in fact, the principles and protocols, the way we developed it was the small group that I was a part of within ARC, basically crowdsourced from ourselves and what we already knew about existing principles in engaged research, participatory action research, all these other sort of areas that do similar ethical sort of forms of scholarship. So that's where the basis for our stuff came out of, was existing literature, but also our personal experience, and then vetted through dialogue with other movement groups. And I think one thing I'll add is that, we definitely wanted this community of practice, because one of the things we heard from our feedback partners was, hey, it'd be great if scholars had their own shit together, meaning we as movements organize, and we have organizations, we have decision-making structures, we can move together because we are a movement, whereas you guys are just a collection of individuals, basically. But if you actually create a formalized sort of set of relationships, some ethics or boundaries for what it means to be part of that group, then you can act as a group, and we have been sort of, there's the Zapatista phrase, which is we questioning, we walk, and basically, that we're figuring out how to be as a group as we do more things together. The principles and protocols are an iterative document, because we know that as we start collaborating more and more, we're going to need to revisit them or think about how we organize ourselves. But we've only been around since basically 2016, 17. And we've already done a lot of projects at the international level with the civil society mechanism, sort of in relationship to the work that civil society is doing around food policy through the UN. We did some stuff around the Green New Deal here. We've been, yeah, I don't know, Maywa, are there any other things in ARC that you want to talk about that might like have been the interesting parts for you? Because I feel like, I guess I see it as like community practice where we're really just creating that community of people who do this and camaraderie and sharing resources and all that within. And then we're also starting to work with others and developing that sort of external dialogue.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think early on, as we sort of defined ourselves as a scholar activist group that wanted to subordinate research for research's sake to research questions that were socially necessary as defined by community organizations and grassroots movements, we rapidly figured out that requires a lot of listening and learning. And the go-to for a lot of scholars is to be like, come to my conference, come to my classroom. And there's some really nice work by John Gaventa who talks about power and space and power in space. And I'm going to say it again because Antonio hasn't heard it enough. But he talks about invited, provided, and created spaces. So the provided ones are like very top down. We're just going to tell you essentially what to do. The invited is a little bit better because we're going to invite you in. You're going to have a seat at the table. What indigenous communities like to say is like, who said I want a table at all? Maybe I want to use that wood to make a fire, And so that's about like a created space or maybe a co-created space, because who owns that space, whose territory that is more likely to hold power in that space. So, ARC has been thinking about that and think, we potentially need to pick ourselves up and go where movements are, make ourselves a bit more uncomfortable and do work for a movement, whether it be like Jackie often speaks about taking notes, helping, providing labor. So early on, we kind of set ourselves the standard of trying to upend the process of learning through going where movements are. Many folks have already participated in different regional and national meetings of the US Food Sovereignty Alliance. So we have a nice connection with them already. And so I would say like going where movements are is like one of our slogans or watchwords that kind of holds us accountable to how we're learning. Again, to what Antonio said, the sort of political education in the community of practice, we've, because of COVID, sort of been slammed into Zoom space only, and we've been able to spend a lot more time just doing that, both just speaking among ourselves. And I think today we had a meeting earlier today. It was really kind of nice to see the same people showing up, and we're getting to know each other more as human beings. So that has been nice. We've also been able to invite practitioners into the space. For example, Patty Naylor and George Naylor came in to talk about price parity, farm parity, what it means to think about, changing the whole productionist political economy and thinking about like constraining supply and having fair prices for farmers. They've been working really hard with the Sanders campaign to reinstitute some of the supply management policies that come from the New Deal, but could be reimagined and reconfigured to not be racist like the old New Deal was, and like be better than that. So it was really great to have them in that space. So I would say like political education, communities of practice, going where movements are. And maybe a third thing, it's not really like a bucket, but I find it really challenging to simultaneously be wanting to always expand the sphere of what we value as knowledge and knowledge production. And at the same time, we have found that we're often very strategically useful to our movement partners because we are seen as scientists, right? And we can sort of dot the I's and cross the T's and sign our names with PhDs and institutions and chairs and say like, this is evidence-based. And so I think it's challenging to do both. I think we're kind of learning how to do that, but sometimes we almost are forced to create a bit of an artificial separation. And this happened with the CSM, the civil society mechanism, where we actually had some information from them about their input to the high-level panel of experts. And we actually wrote our reviews according to our knowledge of what they were recommending, but we couldn't say this out loud or in public because this had to be an independent scientific review. So unfortunately, yeah, it's weird.
And it was fully scientifically based. I mean, like it was the classic thing. It was a whole report. It had all the references. It was science, but we did it basically by being attentive to what were the different sort of argumentative points or really key considerations that the civil society group wanted to do. And we could have, another approach would have been to be like, oh, we're part of the civil society group, but then we'd be just dismissed as, oh, those advocate scientists.
Right. Absolutely.
And so, yeah, there is, it's definitely, it's not like there's not been an easy answer because it's kind of, I think what I feel like we've learned so far is so much is case by case. Sometimes it's imperative that we take up a separate scientific sort of position and not be seen as part of the movements. And sometimes it's important for us to elevate movement knowledge as knowledge. And that's where I think the Parity Project is a good example. I can't remember the URL right now. I can share it with the class, but that project involves a bunch of ARC participants, ARC scholars, but they also have a bunch of movement folks who are part of the team creating all of this written and video and other kinds of output to talk about what parity could look like in this updated, non-racist, gender-aware, kind of model, right? And so I think that's where we're dealing with the tension of like, we want to validate these other kinds of knowledges to the extent we can, while we also use our position as scientists to sort of advocate. And I guess that's one of the last
Absolutely. Yeah, I put the link in the chat. Disparity.
One of the last things is I was just thinking, like, one of ARC's other sort of parts of its principles is that we want to create institutional change to essentially more structurally validate other forms of knowledge, right? And to also validate the fact that the kind of research I do often is in partnership with movement groups, which is still seen as sort of novel or not necessarily valid to everyone. So I wonder, maybe you could talk about like, how is our vision for institutional change? How do you see that working out, especially now that you have this position in an institution? Some people would say, oh, you can't change these institutions. They're impossible. But obviously, they have changed over time.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this, actually.
Well, I mean, of course I have thoughts about it. I always have thoughts about something. But yeah, I feel like I'm stoked about ARC, of course, because I think this idea of not limiting ourselves to the notion of changing things on the individual level or in our small fiefdoms, but actually having the pie in the sky dream of like, what if universities were always embedded in relationships with various kinds of practitioners, right? And that wasn't a special thing that some parts of science did, but that even, for example, how you started, right? The disembodied sort of lab-based work, which is like, I actually believe in basic research. I think basic research is really important, that people should do research that doesn't have an immediate practical outcome. That's important. But what if that lab had to have some engagement with the different sectors whose work would be impacted by developments of that basic research? Like, that would be amazing for actually having not a business school with a single ethics course, but a way of developing a new form of business that was inherently ethical. So for me, I think like when we think about abolition and this notion of a completely changed university, abolishing a university that is rooted in a colonial capitalist model that divorces people from their knowledge and their work, right? We can start reintegrating these things, and it might be small for now, but simply making the kind of activist scholarship we do in food systems more legitimate and real and supported, is a step at least in that direction. And so I still think it's like worthwhile, even though I do have my skepticisms about how much the university as currently constituted will adopt it. But
yeah. One of the challenges I think we've talked about quite a bit in ARC is that we all lack time and bandwidth and ability to really put a lot of sweat equity into ARC type of work because we're trying to hold down a job, and the jobs that we have don't reward the work we're doing. So we actually have to do both, and then they become antagonistic to their mutual success. So, you know, one of the institutional pieces we've been talking about is slowly trying to push universities to remake rewards and incentive structures. So right now, you know, you're evaluated for tenure mostly upon your research and publishing profile, which, I mean, I like to write, so I'm usually not like saying this is a terrible thing, but there are certain things that almost run really contradictory to some of our principles and protocols. For example, some of the highest impact factor journals, some of the most prestigious, are not open access, you know, and so like I might want to get my paper into Journal of Rural Studies or you know, is it the Annals of Geography, and those are not like as accessible as the Journal of Community Food Systems Research. So those are aspects that we always are hoping to make the products of our research accessible to the communities with whom and whose knowledge like has shaped the research product. And yet, if we're thinking about getting to tenure and getting the rewards, those are like not currently complementary. Right now, basically the whole set of system incentives and rewards doesn't really help us at all like develop as scholar activists. So one of the pieces there has been us thinking about how do tenured faculty like make this thing happen, because it's really difficult if you don't even have that power yet. How do you shift those gears? The other thing we've been thinking about more in ARC, I think, is in order to make the work not like both like to essentially take on two jobs when you join ARC and you're still trying to like make a living in faculty, is bring in your make the center of your lab, like your postdocs and your graduate students, bring them into the ARC space. So their PhD projects, their master's degrees, or their postdoc fellowship work gets really centered from the beginning on research projects or questions that come out of a dialogue or come out of conversations with movement needs. And then I think we start to align the stars a little bit more, because we're like providing mentorship advice to our grad students while accomplishing ARC inspired work, rather than like, oh God, I got to jump off the phone because now I have to like do my real job. So I'm thinking about those things too as I start to grow my own lab and bring in students. I'm like, oh, you're interested in agroecology? We have this thing called ARC. So that's how I'm thinking a little bit more about institutional change. And I think this paper, you know, having it ironically in a peer-reviewed journal also helps to legitimize the work. And like, this is the vanguard, this is the cutting edge, you know, catch up with us. So I'm hoping.
Right? It's just published 2021. This is like the most new science you could find out there on this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel like this thing of figuring out just what you can do within the different, like for all of us in ARC, figuring out what we can do within our positions. And some of that is like, we just had an example of that on the call today, where there's a potential project that's of relevance for sort of international policymaking stuff, but that might bring in funds. And ARC, a lot of the folks in ARC who have jobs don't necessarily need those funds, but we would be able to do work being paid by our institutions to do similar stuff that would then bring in funds that they could then direct to our social movement partners to actually increase their ability to participate in dialogues with us, or to fund graduate students who need more funds, right? So we're like figuring out ways to essentially move resources around or get things like more balanced essentially between those who tend to have and those who tend not to. And I think that's something that's what I'm inspired by often being in ARC, is that I haven't seen a group of such committed people who have that committed sense of common values, we're able to work from a lot of different personal positions on very, in a very aligned way, and with a lot of love for each other. Like I don't mean to sound cheesy, but it's not like a lot of activist groups where you have a lot of acrimony between people, or things break down, and we've just been able to have a pretty good time in ARC. So I feel like that's saying something about how well we're working. I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it felt really good today, actually, to have folks who hadn't been present for a while come back in, and it was an amazing conversation. And we also have people of different abilities. So Alistair, my PI, for example, is non-hearing, and Garrett is always so sensitive on it, taking notes, transcribing, so Alistair can participate. There's a whole tradition within abolition called cripping abolition. It's like disability justice. Like they're I would say at the vanguard of thinking through like transformative disability justice. Again, the kind of non-binaries going on here. So I appreciate that. The redistribution of resources, I think is another like touchstone, that it is so important, and it kind of ties into some work that I've done on commoning. As you know, Antonio, is like, ideally I wish we lived in like a non-monetized system and we wouldn't have need for money at all. In the meantime, like survival pending revolution, we still rely on funding. And so thinking about how we actually sort of play Robin Hood and take from sources that have some and give it to others, there's a lot of I think parallels in abolition and in agroecology, where those of us who have access to funds are committed to thinking about how we sort of funnel that around. Come and give a talk in my course. Oh, $5,000 as an honorarium. Oops. For the community work. I've seen that happen, and I think it's fantastic. If there's not another way, that's a good method. I'm into it. And
then meanwhile, at the same time, we're actually trying to push institutions to put more money towards the things they should be putting money towards, right? And then, like you mentioned, incentivizing, for example, making tenure decisions actually about public scholarship and publishing stuff that's accessible to the public, or about engaged kinds of research or engaged kinds of work, let's say. So there's other that we're doing that's not just about money per se, but actually shifting the incentive structure. We should probably wrap up because I am missing another meeting I'm supposed to be at, but this is far more interesting than that meeting would be. And I guess we'll see you in a couple weeks for Q&A. And I don't know if there's anything you want to leave folks with that you didn't get to, or anything coming up in this term or on campus that people should be aware of.
Good question. Not that I know of. But I appreciate you opening this classroom space to share with me, Antonio. It's always a pleasure to chat. And if people want to contact me, you have my email, Antonio. You can pass it along. I'm available and willing to talk further about anything that I've said. And thank you. It's been fun.
I expect some really good questions. We've been getting some pretty good questions in the Q&A, so be prepared.
Awesome.
All right.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks.